All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome. Tonight, we're going to talk about the origin of flavors and aromas in wine. And this is for VIDI 304 wine components for our course at Folsom Lake College. Okay. So I want to start off by saying every wine is unique, right? So not every wine is the same. No matter how hard you tried, that's kind of the beauty of wine. No matter how hard you tried, if you found a wine that you really loved, as soon as it's all sold out, it's gone. You'll never have the exact same thing again. It's a moment in time. It happened once. The conditions that it took for that season, the climate, how the grapes ripened, how it was made, how everything came together could never actually fully be replicated. You could have something very similar, but every wine is unique, which is really cool, right? Also, in the sense of every wine is unique in how it can be made as well. So for example, here I have Tempranillo. It's typically served as a dry red wine, right? It could also be made as a white wine, a rosé, a sparkling wine, a dessert wine. The list goes on, right? So Tempranillo is just the grape variety. The decisions of how it could end up being as a final product is down to the winemaker, the terroir, and many other things, right? And a lot of times in the world of wine, sometimes accidents happen and then amazing products happen as a result of that. So there are always really fun stories to be shared. And that's one of the reasons that wine is so special, right? So not every wine is the same. However, there are certain commonalities between varieties, right? So every wine is unique, but there is a baseline of characteristics that are typically found in each variety, right? So Wine Folly is a great source for a lot of people learning about wine. I highly recommend utilizing the books and the online resources through Wine Folly. Madeline Puckett's done a great job. One thing that she does very well is she has in her book, Wine Folly, she has pages on just about every type of grape variety out there, every type of wine that's made. And you can look, and what'll come with it are the typical aromatics and flavors that are found in each variety, right? So not to say that that's the final word of what should be in a Tempranillo, for example. But if you are learning how to taste wine and trying to figure out, oh, how do I identify a Tempranillo when I'm tasting if someone doesn't tell me? Well, once you start to get the taste for it, you'll see that across the board, most Tempranillos, say for a dry red version, have similar characteristics, right? So that's what that book is. One of the reasons I really enjoy using that book, right? So very helpful when doing blind tastings to help identify which varieties are present, right? So the big question today is where does wine flavor and aromas come from, right? So it's a very complicated answer. There's a lot that goes into it. Ultimately, we like to break it down into primary, secondary, and tertiary aromas. So primary, you see this is first, second, third. Primary is the grape itself, right? So you can think about the variety, where it was grown, the terroir. That is it, the grape itself. Secondary aromas include activity of microorganisms, processing choices. So this is really like the winemaking side of things. Anytime a human intervention, human came in and did something in the winemaking process is how I like to describe it. It's a little more complicated than that in the grand picture, but for beginners, this is a good place to start, right? Anytime a winemaker came in and made a decision and it impacts the flavor, that is secondary aromas. Tertiary aromas are aging in both the barrel and the bottle. So when we talk about tertiary aromas in the world of sommeliers and somms, it's really referring to the time spent in the bottle. I can tell you on the winemaking side of things, very similar chemistry happens during aging in the barrel as well. So I like to specify barrel and bottle aging, right? And we do have a link here from Wine Folly's website about primary, secondary, and tertiary aromas for your pleasure. Cool. So I have this kind of flow chart here, right? Primary, secondary, and tertiary, just to give you like a sneak preview, but we're going to dive into more detail about this in just a moment, right? So for primary aromas, we like to also call this as varietal aromas, right? So these originate in the grapes and they can vary according to the vine and the terroir, so i.e. the land and more, right? Generally speaking, they cover fruity and floral nuances, and they are the pure expression of viticulture, right? So pure expression of the land and the grape itself. Primary aromas, right? Secondary aromas are pre-fermentation and fermentation aromas. So these come about in both alcoholic and malolactic fermentations. If you haven't taken the winemaking class or you aren't familiar with the process of winemaking, that's okay. Primary and malolactic just refer to the two fermentations that most all wines go through, specifically for reds. And this is the conversion of sugar to alcohol in primary fermentation, and malolactic fermentation is the conversion of malic to lactic acid. So we don't have to dive too far into that, microbiochemistry today. But we have another slide with a little bit more information to clarify that for you, right? So the flavors and aromas that occur from secondary aromas are very vast. It's a lot, right? The yeast and bacteria that you choose are what ends up utilizing these nutrients and going through these transformations, these metabolisms, are going to produce a lot of aromas, right? So they vary according to maceration time, fermentation temperatures, and yeast strains used. They are a development of winemaking. So kind of like I described, anything where, we came in and started to get our hands into the mix, that's where secondary aromas really come in, right? Tertiary aromas are post-fermentation and maturing. So this comes from oxidation in barrel matured wines. Reds, mostly. There are some white wines that are aged in barrels, but 90% are reds. This can also form from the reduction of wines preserved from the air as wines mature and age in bottles. So overall, all of the tertiary aromas are a result of aging, right? So we're going to talk more specifically about what those aromas look like in just a moment here. And we're actually going to have a whole presentation on wine barrels and wine aging and what happens to the chemistry of wine as it ages and why aged wine is typically so sought after compared to younger wines sometimes. Okay, so primary aromas, the grape itself, right? So let's talk about the grape. So primary flavors come directly from the grape and the environment it grows in. Aroma compounds are present in both the skin and in the juice of the grape in the form of volatile and non-volatile compounds, right? So what's present in the grape and in the, the juice are oftentimes precursors for the aromas that we're going to get in the wine itself, right? And it has to go through that process of transformation during fermentation to bring out those flavors, right? So aromatic compounds is a very large group, chemical class of compounds, right? And they have a certain structure associated with them to give them that ability to be volatile, so that way we smell them, right? So oftentimes, if you really get into more advanced tasting courses, you might hear professionals talk about wines in accordance to these chemical groups. So like pyrazines, terpenes, esters, and thiols, right? And they are correct ways to describe wine, but it's kind of like a more elevated advanced terminology, right? So pyrazines would mean that you're getting green vegetal aromas like grass and bell pepper. And terpenes would be referring to floral aromas of rose, lavender, and lychee. Esters would be banana, apple, strawberry. Thiols would be passion fruit, grapefruit, right? So if you can just identify those aromas, that's a wonderful place to start. If you want to become more advanced in your wine tasting terminology, you can start to get these characters, right? And there are certain varieties of wine that are associated with these things. So like Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, Sauvignon Blanc, even Merlot and Malbec are associated with pyrazines. So that green aroma. So think if you ever had a Cabernet Sauvignon that tastes like bell pepper, pyrazines, boom. So if you want to be that fancy person at a wine tasting that says this Cabernet Sauvignon has very sophisticated pyrazines or very pronounced pyrazines, you're saying it's got a lot of bell pepper, period, right? Both are correct. It's just if you want to be at that level, right? Terpenes are really common in the muscat family. It's found in the skins, and this is where you get a lot of those lovely floral aromas. And then esters, we get in a lot of wines. Thiols is very, very popular with Sauvignon Blanc, where you can get that passion fruit and that grapefruit component, right? So, like I said, there are some grape varieties that these aromas are associated with very strongly, but you can find them in many different grape varieties. and many different wines, right? So those are just an example of some of the aromatics that just come from the grape itself, right? So these are all impacted by the variety, the clone, the rootstock, the soil, the terrain, seasonal variation, and much more. So all these factors come together to describe a concept called terroir, right? And again, we're still just talking about the grape. We have not even touched the winemaking process, right? I also have a picture here for you of the primary aromas that are found in Tempranillo. So this was taken from Wine Folly, so it's a really good example of what you would find in Tempranillo. So cherry, dried fig, cedar, tobacco, and dill. So this was Wine Folly's impression of the common traits that she finds in Tempranillo from all the Tempranillos that she's tasted in her studies and her travels, right? And then she has a taste profile. So typically Tempranillos are pretty dry, medium to full body, medium to high tannins, medium to high acidity, and can be found from 13.5 to 15% alcohol, right? So that is, again, just a general trend of things that we see on the market and what you can find accessible to you, right? If you want to get into the real creative winemaking side, like I mentioned before, you can make Tempranillo however you want. You could make a white wine out of Tempranillo. You could make a sparkling, a rosé, and it could be sweet. It could be dry. Maybe there's no tannins. Maybe there's a ton of tannins, right? So how it ends up being made is another conversation, but what is typical and what is found in the market is something else, right? Okay, cool stuff. So on to the concept of terroir. You're going to get into the wine community or the wine industry. Either it's just like a wine taster, or maybe you just want to know the terminology and taste from home, or you want to work in this industry. You are absolutely going to hear the word terroir, and it's a French word which means a sense of place. So it means the influence of the surrounding area on the grapes and thus the resulting wine, right? So I always like to think of it in the concept of like people who purchase honey from local areas, right? So a lot of people will purchase honey that is produced locally. It's supposed to help with your allergies, get used to the pollen that's in the air of where you live, right? Whether or not there's merit to that, I'm not sure. That's not my expertise, but I can think of a really good example of terroir would be you're harvesting honey from an area where there's lavender and sage and rosemary planted, right? And it's very specific to the region of where that honey was produced, right? You take honey from somewhere else, and maybe that was grown somewhere completely different, right? So the effect of the taste of honey is going to be completely different depending on where it was produced and the flowers that were around that beehive, right? So it's just like that with wine, right? And so we really like to break it down into these 4 large groups. These are the big things that affect the terroir and therefore the resulting wine. So it's climate. So whether you have a hot, cold, temperate climate, this all affects the resulting styles. We're going to talk more about that in this next slide. Soil, whether you have clay, sand, silt, or loam, the amount of drainage that your vines have, the nutrients available, the overall growth of the vines. This affects the productivity and the health of the vine, and therefore the health of the grapes, how much is produced and how much they're able to ripen. So soil has a huge impact, right? Topography, hills, shade, sun exposure, elevation, all plays a major role into the exposure of the sun, but also microclimates and much more. So that's something that we talk about a lot when we have like really focused tastings with customers. When as a winemaker, that's what we do. We talk about the topography a lot. And then also the surrounding plants. So flora, the flowers, native yeast and bacteria, all of this is constantly surrounding us and the grapes, and it affects the wine. So a concept of this would be Sierra Spice. So in the Sierra Foothills AVA, we're talking about how a lot of our vineyards are surrounded by evergreen trees, these conifers, that the oils blow onto the grapes and produce really fresh wines. So it's like this fresh pine, almost like this mountainous aroma in our wines. It's extremely present in our Cabernet Franc. So that's the concept we're talking about. And it's also something that's commonly talked about in Australia. So if you like wines from Australia, like red wines, Australia has tons of eucalyptus trees. It's native to Australia, and eucalyptus trees are extremely oily. So you can very readily find red wines that have eucalyptus characters in them, if you like eucalyptus, from Australia, which is cool. And I like eucalyptus, so I think that's really cool. So highly recommend you go and get a bottle and try it. So those are the concepts that really surround terroir. Okay, so now for like more of a sneak peek into cool versus warmer conditions or climates for wines. And a lot of these I like to say are generalizations. So these are like really like kind of like your first look into when people who are in the wine industry or sommeliers talk about this is a cool climate wine versus a hot climate wine. These are generalizations of those areas, but certain vineyards might have microclimates. So even though they exist in an area that's known as like a warmer climate, they might actually have a microclimate on their vineyard that allows them to do something that's exceptional to the rule, right? So cool versus warm conditions. So for cool climate fruit, think of like your coastal areas, think of like traditional European areas are next to rivers, right? So something where it's, or even like parts of New York, right? Very cool conditions, right? So think it's gonna be less ripeness in the fruit. You're gonna have more acid in the fruit. So it's tart, bright fruit flavors, higher acid all over as a whole, and lower sugar because it's cooler conditions. It doesn't ripen as much as warmer conditions. So lower sugar leads to lower alcohol. Lower alcohol means lighter in body. So they're typically leaner wines, fresher wines with a lot of nuance and easy to drink because they're just lighter, right? For warmer conditions, these are our really ripe, fruity, dominated wines. So fruit forward, not necessarily sweet wines. You can, of course, produce sweet wines in either condition, but there's a lot of dry wines that come from warmer conditions. It just depends on the decisions made during the winemaking process, right? So more ripeness in the fruit, softer, sweeter fruit flavors. So we talk about sweeter fruit flavors. That means it tastes like ripe cherries or ripe blackberries compared to just maybe regular blackberries or tart blackberry, right? So it has that impression, even though the wine itself may not be sweet, may or may not be sweet, it has those flavors, right? Generally speaking, these wines will have lower acid and higher sugar. Higher sugar leads to higher alcohol, and higher alcohol means fuller bodied wines, so bigger wines. And we haven't really talked about the concept of light versus full bodied yet. We'll get into that for sure more. But if this is new to you, think about the difference of having water in your mouth versus having whole milk, right? So you can actually feel the weight of the milk in your mouth. Those are a fuller bodied beverage, right? It's very viscous. So alcohol and sugar and tannins, these kind of all contribute to weight of a wine, and so they'll be fuller bodied. Cool. Okay, so for example, I have Chardonnay for you, and then the next example I have is Syrah. So Chardonnay is something that is grown everywhere. It's one of the noble grapes, right? So it's originated in France and it's grown just about everywhere, and everyone makes their own version. The cool thing about this is that Chardonnay is very expressive of depending on the winemaking decisions and also the climate that it's grown in, right? So cool climate Chardonnay will have high acid, green fruit, citrus fruit, and vegetable components, right? So cucumber, lemon, apple, pear, and high acids. It'd be very crisp and refreshing white wines. In a moderate climate, so something slightly warmer, you'll still have some citrus, but then you'll start to see some expression of stone fruit come out. So peach is an example of that. Stone fruit is just a fruit that's grown that has the pit in the center. We call it the stone, right? So peach, nectarines, things like that. So white peach is an example. And then they also see a little bit of tropical fruit coming out. So mango, potentially, right? For the hot climate Chardonnay, we see a lot more tropical fruit just in general. So these are more like ripe fruit flavors, right? So banana, pineapple, peach, mango, fig. These are all really nice flavors, but what the big takeaway is these three different climates produce three very, very different wines, right? And that's just the climate. The winemaking decisions and everything else, the aging, all will contribute to the final product. So I really like this example. I use it in a lot of my slides. Thank you, WSET, for this picture. Okay, So that's a really good example for a white wine. I wanted to include an example of what that would look like for a red wine, just for reference as well. So for Syrah, Syrah is also grown in a lot of places, right? It originated from France as well. But we have cool climate versus warmer climate in this slide as well. So a cool climate Syrah would be higher acid, right? So similar trend, just like we saw with this page up here, right? Higher acid, lower sugar, lower alcohol, right? Also, as far as the flavors go, we see a lot more of the earth, herbaceous, and savory components in cooler climate Syrahs. So here, Wine Folly has cited black pepper, olives, and smoked meat, right? That is a really fun wine in itself, right? But when you take that Syrah and you plant it in a warmer climate, typically you have fuller bodied, higher alcohol, ripe wine. So ripe as in like that ripe fruit flavor, right? So here we have blackberry, plum, and cocoa, some chocolate notes. So very different wines, right? And depending on what style you might like more, maybe when you go shopping, you'd want to know like which regions are typically cooler climate and which regions are warmer climate. So that way you can purchase a Syrah that you know that you're going to like, right? Cool. Okay, so that was all a very extensive conversation about primary flavors in wine. Now we're going to move on to secondary flavors, right? So primary refers to the fruit itself and the terroir. Now we're going to talk about activity of microorganisms. This is where secondary flavors come in, and this is where, like I mentioned before, any time that we get our hands in the mess, right, as winemakers, this is where when we start adapting flavors because the decisions that we make, right? So wine goes through fermentation, sometimes more than once, primary and secondary fermentation. For the first fermentation of when we convert sugar to alcohol, that's yeast. We use yeast for that, right? For the second fermentation, from malic to lactic acid, we use a bacteria for that. So within just that, there are thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of different types of yeast and bacteria out there that a winemaker could select that has specialized characteristics, brings out certain flavors and aromas. It could be something that's traditional that was isolated from that part of the world, right? So if you're going to make a Cabernet Sauvignon, there's actually a yeast called BDX, which means Bordeaux. It was isolated from Bordeaux. So if you wanted to make a very traditional Cabernet Sauvignon, then you could use that yeast, right? You don't have to. You could pick whatever you want, but that'd be a good place to start, right? So lots of types, all with different specialties, right? So depending on what you use, different aromas will be expressed in a wine, and it can be very different, right? So typically speaking, we use Saccharomyces species for yeast, and we use a lactic acid bacteria for the bacteria portion of this, right? There is a trend going on, and there's more information and education on native winery or grape flora. So this is the native yeast or bacteria that exists in your vineyard and in your winery, right? You can utilize that and do what we call native fermentations. The important thing to take away from that portion is don't say natural yeast, because all yeast and bacteria are natural. You're talking about native. So the species that live natively in your place of work or where the vineyard is, right? Big difference. Big difference. So you can utilize that. It can be unpredictable unless you isolate it and know what it is and work with it, right? It's a lot of the work that Opus One has done is they've isolated a bunch of native yeast from different parts of their vineyard and winery, and then they isolated what they liked, and then they cultivate it, and then they inoculate tanks with it. It's really cool, right? But there's a lot of research and money that goes into that not every winery can do, right? Okay, so big takeaways. Characters that come into wine from yeast are typically fruity aromas, spice, and mouthfeel. From bacteria, we get a creamy mouthfeel, and we taste butter popcorn and butterscotch components, right? So the butter popcorn butterscotch is really for white wines. For red wines, it really just helps with the mouthfeel and the stability and the overall health of the wine, but that's more of a winemaking class concept. And we can talk about that later if you'd like. So big takeaways, the type of yeast and bacteria that are involved will have a huge impact on the flavors and aromas and the mouthfeel of the wine. Cool. So processing decisions are also part of this conversation, right? So the yeast and bacteria utilized are one part, but anything else that we physically do with the grapes impacts the flavor, right? So the conditions at harvest, the maceration choices. So this means the time spent with the grape skins during fermentation. For red wines, we ferment the juice on its skins. Typically it's crushed and destemmed. So this picture here, right? So it looks like this beautiful, vibrant, like pomegranate colored mix here, right? And so the fermentation, the juice on the skins is extracting the color from the skins, right? So whether or not you choose to keep the skins on longer or take them off sooner will impact the flavor, right? Extraction conditions, this means it could be hot or cold, for a short time, for a long time. Whether or not you make additions to the juice or must. During the winemaking process, we can add water, acid, all sorts of interesting things to help the wine in the long run. So that will impact it as well, right? Fermentation conditions, lees contact. Lees is just the fancy word for leftover yeast or bacteria, and much more, right? So basically every decision that we make is going to impact the final outcome of this wine. So if you're interested in this, sign up for the winemaking class in the fall. However, this is kind of like the big takeaway of some other things that could happen that impact the flavor of the wine, right? Okay, and then last but not least, we have tertiary flavors. So this is commonly referred to for bottle aging, but it also applies to barrel aging of wine. I do want to stress that. So factors that affect tertiary aromas would be the time, how long it ages, the temperature of the aging, right? Most cellars are kept very cold, and that is for a very good reason, right? We don't want to cook the wine. We want it to age gracefully. The cooperage. So if it's aged on oak in a barrel, right? How long it was in that barrel, what type of oak it was, right? The pH of the wine will impact how it ages, evaporation, agitation, oxygen exposure, lees exposure, right? So a lot of these are referring to the barrel aging process, right? But it's very important that the time in the bottle and how the bottle is stored is very important as well. So as you can see in this photo, we have some really old bottles, right? And some of them are stored on their side. It's very important that wine is stored on its side for most wines, except for sparkling. But for most wines, it's very important to store on its side because you're actually keeping the wine in contact with that cork. And if that cork dries out, when you open the bottle, it's going to disintegrate and you get a bunch of pieces of cork in your bottle. You don't want to do that. You want the bottle to stay on its side as it ages, so that way it keeps the cork wet, and that way it doesn't crumble when you take out the cork, right? So that is the best case. You also want to keep the wine out of the sunlight in a cool, dark room. And yeah, those are the biggest points, right? For bottle aging, right? So as wine ages, these tertiary flavors start to develop and they become more prominent in wines. And so examples of what tertiary aromas could be vanilla, baking spices, stone, mushroom, smoke, tobacco, leather, mocha, coconut, coffee, and there's more, right? There's a lot. And a lot of this is an impact of what oak the winemaker used, but a lot of these can just develop in the grape. If you don't use any oak, these can develop on their own in the wine over time. The one thing that we do see in wines that are made without oak as they age is they typically are lighter than the ones made with oak because that oak adds a lot of structure, which is really nice, right? And it also adds some tannin, and that can help with the ability for the wine to age, right? So it's very good. Okay, and with that, we have our learning objectives. So before you take the quiz, feel free to go through this. I recommend that you do. If you feel comfortable answering these questions, then I think you'll be in a really good spot and be ready to take the quiz. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. But otherwise, I'll look forward to seeing you guys next time.